Daniel, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. This is a follow-on to the episode we just recorded about decision-making in the Polycrisis era, and we decided that it would be a good idea to spend a little bit more time talking about the decision-making aspect of the Polycrisis era, whereas the first episode was largely about, and very important, but largely about becoming more informed and understanding the dimensions of the Polycrisis era. So welcome back. Pleasure to talk to you as always.
Thank you, Ben.
But we talk about decision-making, and I think this is a really good way to transition into what we mean by decision-making and decision quality. Most business schools don't teach decision-making, and that's quite shocking when you think about it, because people that graduate from business school or public admin schools or what have you probably should have a good grounding in what good decision making looks like, and so we advocate simplifying and thinking about decision quality. So if you look at an organization, you think about all the things that it has. What a good heuristic, a good rule of thumb is to think about, well, do these help us make good decisions or not? And what a good decision simply is making the best decision we can based on the information we have at the time. That's all it is. That sounds very simple, but it's incredibly difficult to practice, because we look at the outcomes of something and we say, well, if the outcome went really well, then let's give that person a promotion. Because they must have had some foresight when they perhaps could have just gotten very lucky. That happens a lot. Or conversely, we could punish individuals for being courageous, making a great decision, but somehow it doesn't work out. But based on what they knew at the time, they made the best possible decision that they could. And so we introduce a short little framework that comes from behavioral science, decision science. We didn't come up with the component parts, but it is based on lots of science and lots of good robust research. And little acronym called FOCUS, which stands for framing, options, cognitive biases, uncertainty, and selection. It's just a way of walking through any potential decision and thinking about, well, does it meet all these criteria under each of these 5 things? And if so, we should go ahead with it. And if not, we should take a step back. So maybe to give a little bit of a flavor of what that is and what that looks like. And again, it's not hard to look at examples of poor decision making. We mentioned in the book the Boeing 737 MAX, which has again been in the news as we talk about decision making. Organizations don't make great decisions, and a lot of the research bears that out. A lot of emotion goes into decision making. And let's just talk a little bit about what we mean by framing. And I think this is a very important aspect of good decision making. And framing is all about figuring out how much or how well does a decision align with what it is we're trying to do, and thinking about how quickly we need to make it and who needs to be involved. And that's all really it is. It's such an important step, though. And I work with a lot of leaders, and one of the parts of framing is figuring out, well, how does this connect with our purpose and values? And if you have a room full of, say, 6 leaders of a team, you could come out of that room with 7 different ideas about what the purpose and objectives of the organization happen to be. There's no exaggeration when I say that. Organizations find it very difficult to align everyone on what it is they're there to do. And if you're not able to figure that out, the rest is incredibly difficult.
What is that all about, Ben? Is it about a failure to communicate? Is it about a failure to ensure that everyone's voice has been included in the determination of what organizational values are, or is it something else?
I think the answer is all of the above. I think it starts with a common understanding, of course, but then you the organization needs to figure out how that translates into the incentive structures, right? So how are bonuses paid, for example, because that drives a lot of the behaviors. And so we can talk about, for example, values associated with sustainability or what have you, but if the sales targets are what they are, that will drive behavior. And so that will create a disconnect. We often hear about there's the kind of formal organization and the informal organization. So the formal organization is how the org structure works, and the informal is how things actually work in practice. And you have to look at the informal. And if the way in which the organization is structured and the incentives align with the purpose, then you're getting somewhere. And it's a lot easier for people to understand what the objectives and the purpose are. And if they don't, then you've got loads of problems. Now, purpose is actually a very well-studied concept. And in a crisis, it's incredibly important, because if everyone's on what the North Star is, then it's easy to make decisions in a crisis situation. And if it's not, then you have a mess. So there's a lot there, but it's the starting point. Another very important question to ask when looking at any big decision is, how reversible is this decision? So in legislation on the environment, there's something called the precautionary principle, which is if it's going to do permanent damage to the environment, we don't do it. I think that kind of thinking is really useful in an organizational context, because if we're making a big decision that we can't go back on, we need to slow down. We need to involve more people. We need to bring in some subject matter experts. If it is reversible, then you can actually move very quickly, and you can conduct some experiments. You can see if something is going to work or not going to work. Organizations spend way too much time making decisions over trivialities, expense reports, travel approvals, whatever the thing is, and too little time on this multi-billion-dollar decisions that are going to make a big difference over decades. Those kinds of decisions need to be made much more slowly and deliberately. And so this framing piece is incredibly important, because it sets everything else up for success or failure.
I would agree, Ben, and it goes ultimately back to basics, which are easy to overlook. And when we're focused on meeting quarterly, semi-annual, annual objectives, and when we're trying to maneuver through all of these new challenges that the polycrisis represents, it is easy to forget about the basics, and we simply can't afford to do that. So it almost calls for having checklists that are prepared to ensure that when we're in the middle of the decision-making process, we don't forget some of the basics.
Yeah, I agree with that. I even think that just having a set of very simple, clear questions when one's making a decision can help with that. So one would be, how reversible is this decision? Another one might be, if this goes wrong, what's the worst that could happen? Another one might be, hey, will this matter in a decade's time? And if it would, then we, again, need to slow down. In many cases, it may not. And in a variety of cases, we can move a lot more quickly. One of the things we also say is that decision-making in the polycrisis era is knowing the difference. It's not slowing down and overanalyzing absolutely everything. You can't do that. It's actually discerning which ones you can make much more quickly. And we talk at some length across the chapters about experiments, about things that the polycrisis era has so much uncertainty and so much complexity that we will not be able to figure out the answers to certain things unless we try certain things. And if something is reversible, it is something that a decision we can make relatively quickly. It may not have a permanent long-term impact. We can experiment. And there are a variety of policy experiments out there that have been successful. So in the chapter, for example, on inequality, we talk about universal basic income. And universal basic income has been tried in places like Japan and Finland and Canadian provinces, and the results have been promising. And so why not look at some of these things and see how they might scale? And that is another way through this is trying some things and seeing if they may or may not work. We also reference, for example, something called the data dividend, that this might be a way of looking at and regulating technology companies and social media companies who use our data. Maybe if we found a way to charge them a little bit of money for that, that might bring in some revenue to the coffers, and it might change some behaviors and find ways to address some of the issues that we mentioned in that chapter regarding social media and AI and so on. So there are lots of ways in which having a good decision-making framework kind of opens up the potential for opportunities and finding answers.
I think we should maybe add that no single individual, no single organization can possibly have all of the answers in terms of knowing exactly what's going to be required at any given point in time. The best that we can do, I think, is to set ourselves up for success by helping to ensure that there are fewer gaps and inconsistencies in policymaking. Mm-hmm. And that is a function of planning and a function of taking the time to ensure that decisions are going to be made on a thoughtful basis. The nature of the polycrisis is such that it's so broad and all-encompassing that it would be really too much to ask of anyone or any organization to be right all the time or to make their margin of error so low as to be negligible. That's a Herculean task. What we're trying to do with the book is set people up for success and to thrive more than just survive in this polycrisis era. And I think by asking many of the questions that we've discussed in this episode, organizations are going to go a long way toward meeting that objective.
I think you're right. And I think you touch on something that is also quite important at this time, and that's humility, that no one entity, no one individual will have all of the answers. And if they claim to do so, then that should be a red flag. we need to try things. We need to work together, and that requires some humility. And it requires uttering every now and then those phrases that are so anxiety-inducing in leaders, which is "I don't know, but let's find out." And so that I think I think you touched on a great point there. I can touch through the final, just maybe a few highlights of some of the other bits of quality decision making. We talk about options, and that's all about figuring out the right number of potential paths. And one thing to point out there is that we often think about the status quo as a safe option. Most organizations, when they invest in something, they have these yes, no, go, no go meetings. And the implicit assumption is the status quo is the safer option against which whatever is being considered is competing. And that's just not true. And in many cases now, the status quo is not the safe option. And we need to start to fight through this status quo bias because it's not helping us. I'd also just mention a couple of other things. The C stands for cognitive biases. We talked a little bit about the need to think differently because human emotion, human psychological failures, if you like, or ways in which we think get in the way of good decision making. And there are lots of techniques to get through that. And one of those is to think like the enemy. So in other words, if you have a big important plan, one of the things you might want to do is to get someone to play the devil's advocate role and to try to poke holes at that plan, that project. This is something called red teaming or red team thinking. It comes from military planning, actually Prussian military planning back in the 19th century, but it is very helpful. And the idea isn't to destroy plans or to knock them down, but to make them more robust. And that's another technique that can be used. I just wanted to mention there. And we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about uncertainty. And we use the word uncertainty and not risk, because uncertainty, I think, captures it much better. Risk is about understanding the likelihood and the impact of something. Uncertainty is when we don't really have that. And the polycrisis era skews more towards uncertainty, and which there's a lovely quote that we mention in the book, which is that the future is plural. So there are many ways in which the future can take shape, and understanding how those may take shape and thinking through scenarios. And we mention a number of techniques in the book around dealing with uncertainty. So just to give readers a bit of a flavor for things that they can practice that are in the book in more detail that help drive that idea of decision quality.
Absolutely right. I think there's a lot of good food for thought in this discussion that we've had today, and people will go away, I think, with the sense that there has certainly been a lot of thought that we put into the book, and at the same time, we don't claim to have all of the answers. Again, we want to set people up to put themselves in a position of being successful in this era. So I think we've given them a good flavor for what they can expect.
Well, look, with that in mind, I think that might be a good place to wrap up. I think two thoughts from me before we do that. I think that there are a couple of character traits that I think everyone needs to have more of if we are going to succeed. And one of those is curiosity. So getting a better sense, or becoming aware and becoming more interested in understanding the world around us is essential. And the second one is the courage to try, the courage to speak truth to power, and all of those things. Those two character traits in particular, I think those add up.
Indeed. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Daniel.